Discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Unlike our previous review, which offers a focused analysis, this feature delivers a comprehensive overview tracing the intellectual roots, key arguments, and real-world impact of this subject. If you appreciate this expanded format and find it helpful, let us know. Your feedback will help shape future content.
And honestly, it really is a bold way to start a discussion.
I mean, it fits the magnitude, though, right?
It definitely fits.
Yeah.
Because we are not looking at a light read today, and it certainly is not a simple story.
No, it is definitely not. So I actually want to start with a riddle of sorts, or maybe a paradox that sits right at the very heart of the material we are covering today.
Okay, let's hear it.
How does a global superpower, arguably the strongest military force in history, win effectively every major military battle ever fights, yet somehow completely lose the war?
Wow. Yeah, that is the question that haunts this entire narrative.
We are talking about a conflict where the eventual victors inherited a totally devastated land, and the so-called losers were left with this massive legacy of deep internal division and just doubt.
Right. It feels like a zero-sum game, but where the sum was actually negative for everyone involved.
Exactly.
That is the central premise of what Stanley Karnow calls the war nobody won. As he explains in the book, it is a tragedy in the classical sense.
Not just a military failure.
Right. A failure of understanding, a failure of culture, and frankly, a failure of history.
And before we unravel that tragedy, I should mention to you, our listener, that you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book summaries. Today we are doing a deep dive into Vietnam, A History by Stanley Karnow.
And just looking at the sheer physical size of this book, this isn't just a dusty textbook. This is widely considered a monumental narrative.
It really is. And the credibility here comes directly from the source. I mean, Karnow wasn't writing from some comfortable library carrel in a university half a world away.
No, he was a journalist historian right on the ground.
Right.
He reported for Time, Life, and The Washington Post directly from Southeast Asia during the conflict.
So when he describes the crushing humidity or the smell of the markets or the tension in a briefing room...
He isn't imagining it. He was actually there.
He lived it.
He interviewed everyone from top American generals to North Vietnamese guerrillas in the field. And what distinguishes this book and why it is still considered a landmark work today is the sheer scope of the timeline.
Right, because as Karnow explains, you cannot understand the American war in Vietnam if you just start the clock in 1965 when the Marines landed at Da Nang.
Which is exactly where most movies start, right?
Yeah. We picture the helicopters, Creedence, Clearwater Revival playing in the background, jungle fatigues.
Right. That is the Vietnam we all know from pop culture.
But Karnow argues that if you start there, if that's your starting point, you've already missed the entire point.
You are basically walking into the movie in the third act.
Exactly. He says you have to understand that this is a struggle against foreign domination that stretches back centuries.
And that is the part that really grabbed me. Because Karnow takes us back 1,000 years.
A full millennium.
Yes. In the chapter, The Heritage of Vietnamese Nationalism, he lays out this context that I think most Americans were, and probably still are, completely unaware of.
It is the crucial context. Because as the text explains, the Vietnamese spent roughly a millennium under Chinese rule.
Just think about the weight of that. 1,000 years. That is longer than the United States has existed several times over.
It is almost unimaginable. So for 10 centuries, they are being occupied by this massive neighbor to the north.
And throughout that entire time, Karnow details this recurring historical pattern. Foreign intrusion, usually China, followed by internal division, and then this fierce, almost biological nationalist mobilization to kick the outsiders out.
Like an immune system response.
Exactly, like an immune system. It became part of their cultural DNA.
So this was the big aha moment for me when reading this. The United States thought they were fighting a war against international communism, right?
Right. A piece of the Cold War map.
Red team versus blue team.
That was the American lens. They saw Vietnam purely as a domino.
But from the Vietnamese perspective, specifically those fighting against the U.S., the Americans were just the latest face in a very long line of foreign invaders.
They were just stepping into a centuries-old cycle.
Precisely. And Karnow argues that the American policymakers completely missed this. They completely underestimated the sheer durability of Vietnamese nationalism.
I mean, you can't bomb an idea that has survived 1,000 years of occupation.
You really can't. And as the book points out, it wasn't just about nationalism. It was deeply tied to authority and belief.
You're referring to the chapter Piety and Power.
Yes. I found this fascinating because it mixes politics with religion in a way we don't usually see in Western history. It felt almost mystical.
Karnow notes that you have to look at the interplay of religion and authority to understand why the population acted the way it did. Vietnam was deeply shaped by Confucian traditions.
Right.
And in that worldview, a leader fundamentally needs the mandate of heaven.
Break that down for us a bit. Is that like the European concept of the divine right of kings?
It is similar, but much more fluid. It is basically about legitimacy. The idea is that if a ruler is just and good nature creates harmony.
Okay.
But if a ruler is corrupt or maybe beholden to foreigners, then natural disasters and social chaos occur. And that proves he has lost the mandate.
So legitimacy isn't just about who has the most tanks or who won a fake election.
No, it's about who has the moral right to rule in the eyes of the universe, essentially.
And Karnow argues that the communists, specifically Ho Chi Minh, managed to capture this ancient concept.
Yes, that's the deep irony Karnow highlights. Ho Chi Minh was a Marxist theoretician, yes. He was a dedicated communist.
Right.
But Karnow shows how he successfully positioned himself to the people as the inheritor of that traditional nationalist patriotism. He was the one kicking out the foreigners.
So he held the mandate.
Exactly. Not the leaders in the South who were visibly supported by the West.
Which brings us to the first modern Western power to run headfirst into this wall, the French.
Ah, yes.
The book details the war with the French in a way that feels like an ominous foreshadowing.
It really is. It's almost like watching a prequel, where you just know the main character is going to make the exact same mistakes as the guy who died in the opening scene.
It is the prequel that explains the main event. Karnow heavily details the rise of the Viet Minh and that climactic, devastating defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Dien Bien Phu just seems to be the exact moment the old world died in Southeast Asia.
It was utterly shocking to the West. I mean, the French were a modern military force. They had air support. They had heavy weapons paratroopers.
And yet they were completely dismantled by a guerrilla army hauling artillery pieces up mountains by hand.
Right by hand. You mean literally dragging cannons up jungle trail.
Piece by piece. Karnow describes this vivid imagery. They strapped them to their backs or pushed them on these reinforced bicycles.
Wow.
It was to show that sheer human will could overcome superior technology. The French just assumed the mountains were impassable for artillery. General Giap and the Viet Minh proved them entirely wrong.
And after that massive defeat, we get the Geneva Conference of 1954.
Right. And as Karnow explains, this was the moment that truly set the stage for the American tragedy. The conference temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel.
Temporarily.
Right. It was supposed to be a temporary fix pending nationwide elections to reunify the country within 2 years.
But those elections never actually happened.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
The U.S. and the newly formed South Vietnamese government blocked them.
Why?
Well, Karnow notes that President Eisenhower himself admitted that if the elections had been held, Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote.
Wow. 80%. So that temporary fix just became the border of the new war.
Exactly.
This leads us into the era of the light that failed.
Hmm.
We really have to talk about Ngo Dinh Diem.
Yes, America's Mandarin.
Karnow calls him America's Mandarin. Now, Mandarin implies a very specific type of bureaucrat, doesn't it? It feels like a loaded word choice by the author.
Oh, that title is incredibly loaded. A Mandarin is a traditional scholar official in the old Confucian system, aloof elite intellectual.
Right.
Diem was the leader the U.S. backed to build a stable, anti-communist South Vietnam. But Karnow notes a massive cultural disconnect here.
Because Diem was Catholic.
Catholic and highly authoritarian in a country that was overwhelmingly Buddhist and very village-oriented.
It seems like the U.S. was trying to build a nation-state, using a blueprint that just didn't fit the landscape at all.
Like trying to plug a square peg into a round hole. But the square peg is also corrupt and refuses to listen to anyone's advice.
That is a very fair assessment. Diem saw himself as a traditional authoritarian figure, almost like an emperor.
Which completely alienated the population. He appointed his fellow Catholics to key positions and largely ignored the rural peasantry. This eventually led directly to the Buddhist crisis.
I think everyone has seen the photo, the monk burning himself in the street in Saigon.
The Thich Quan Duc, yes. It was a shocking image that was broadcast globally. Karnow explains that it utterly destroyed Diem's claim to any moral legitimacy.
It just evaporated.
The book describes how that single image shook the Kennedy administration to its absolute core.
And while this is burning, literally burning, the U.S. is escalating. This is the Kennedy era. The book really delves into the shift from advising to counterinsurgency.
It is a subtle but deadly shift. In the chapter Vietnam is the place, Karnow describes how Vietnam stopped being a local conflict about who rules in Saigon,
Right.
and it became a global test of Cold War credibility.
This is the domino theory in action, right?
Mm.
The idea that if Vietnam falls, the rest of Asia just goes with it.
Exactly. If the U.S. lost, the theory went, they would lose credibility everywhere. Berlin, Korea, Latin America. Vietnam basically became a symbol rather than a real country.
So they stuck with Diem, even as he became a massive liability,
Mm.
until they suddenly didn't. The turning point in 1963.
The coup against Diem. Karnow describes the U.S. giving tacit support for the coup, thinking that if they just removed the unpopular guy, things would naturally stabilize.
But as the chapter Karnow End of Diem makes painfully clear, it was the exact opposite.
It created a total vacuum. Instead of stability, you got this revolving door of weak military governments.
Just generals bickering for power.
While the Viet Cong steadily gained ground in the countryside. And critically, Karnow points out that by supporting the coup, the U.S. implicitly took ownership of the outcome.
They broke it, so now they had to buy it.
Precise.
Well, before we look at how that purchase turned into a massive escalation under LBJ, let's take a beat. This kind of analysis is what we do at Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries and critiques, inspiring reflection and rational thought. And it is incredibly valuable for aspiring authors who want to understand narrative structure.
It is always good to step back and analyze how these historical narratives are constructed. The why is often much more important than the what.
Absolutely. So we are back in the post-Diem chaos. Lyndon B. Johnson is now in the White House. And the book describes this period as disorder and decision.
Poor LBJ. I mean, Karnow paints an incredibly vivid picture of a man completely trapped.
As the text describes in LBJ Goes to War, Johnson had these massive dreams for domestic reform, the Great Society.
Right. He wanted to wage war on poverty, not on the Viet Cong. He genuinely wanted to build schools and hospitals in America.
But he couldn't be the president who, quote-unquote, lost Vietnam.
He was haunted by the ghosts of the past. He was terrified of the political fallout at home.
He thought the Republicans would destroy his domestic agenda if he appeared soft on communism.
Exactly. So you have this agonizing conflict between his domestic desires and the geopolitical demands. And then the Gulf of Tonkin incident happens in 1964.
That's the major political pivot point. Reports of attacks on American ships.
Which, as Karnow details, were murky at best and possibly entirely non-existent,
Right.
but it gave him the sweeping congressional authorization to act. And from there, we see the rapid transition from military advisors to full-scale war in 1964 and 1965.
The scale of the buildup Karnow describes is just staggering. We are talking hundreds of thousands of troops, massive air bases.
And bombing campaign.
Right, bombing campaigns that dropped more tonnage than was used in all of World War II.
It was what they called techno-war. And this is exactly where Karnow highlights the fundamental strategic mismatch.
Because the American strategy was built purely on firepower and mobility.
Right. Use helicopters to find the enemy, then use overwhelming artillery and air power to destroy them. It is strictly a war of attrition.
And the metric for success wasn't territory taken right. I mean, it wasn't like World War II where you capture Berlin and the war is over.
No, the metric was the body count. Since there were no traditional front lines, success was measured purely by how many enemy soldiers were killed.
That sounds incredibly dark.
Karnow points out how corrosive this was. It incentivized commanders in the field to inflate numbers, and it led to excessive use of firepower in civilian areas.
Which just created more enemies.
Exactly.
So we are measuring success by death, not by control. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were playing a completely different game.
They were fighting a war of national survival. Their strategy was extreme patience, local support, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Karnow spends a lot of time describing this trail, doesn't he?
Yes, he details this logistical miracle. It was a massive web of jungle paths running through Laos and Cambodia.
And it kept the supplies flowing no matter how much the U.S. bombed it.
Right. It shows how the U.S. was trying to fight a conventional war against an enemy that simply refused to be conventional.
And that leads directly to the escalation chapter. The casualty lists are growing week by week. The countryside is being practically destroyed.
And Karnow makes this really sharp observation about the futility of it all. The U.S. was actually winning the battles. Tactically, they were far superior.
But they weren't changing the political reality on the ground.
Not at all.
Which brings us to the ultimate breaking point. 1968, the Tet Offensive. This really feels like the climax of the narrative where the illusion finally shatters.
It really is the climax. Tet was a massive, highly coordinated surprise attack by communist forces on cities all across South Vietnam, including Saigon and Hue.
And this was during a holiday truce, wasn't it?
Yes, Tet is the Lunar New Year. It's the biggest holiday in Vietnam, so the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were caught completely off guard.
Karnow recounts eyewitness reports of the sheer brutality of it, specifically in Hue, where communist forces committed terrible atrocities.
Yes, the text is very clear on that. It was a savage battle for the city. They systematically executed thousands of government workers and civilians.
Just horrific.
It was. But here's the major paradox that Karnow presents. Militarily, Tet was an absolute disaster for the North and the Viet Cong.
Wait, a disaster for them. But I thought Tet was the reason the U.S. eventually left.
That is the paradox. The Viet Cong came out of the jungle to fight in the open.
And they got hammered by American firepower.
Exactly. They lost huge numbers of troops. They didn't hold the cities for long. By standard military metrics, the U.S. won handily.
But psychologically.
Psychologically, it was the end.
Because the American public had been told for years there was light at the end of the tunnel.
Right, that the enemy was wearing down.
Okay.
And then suddenly the enemy is literally inside the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon on the evening news.
It just broke the American political will to fight. It proved the war was nowhere near over.
It proved that the body count metric didn't matter at all.
And that ushered in the era the book calls debate and doubt. The anti-war movement explodes back home. And inside the government, you have people finally realizing this isn't winnable in the traditional sense.
Which leads us to the Nixon era. The strategy shifts to what they famously called Vietnamization.
Which sounds like a good thing on paper, right? Letting the Vietnamese take over the defense of their own country. We'll train you, give you the guns, and we'll go home.
In theory, sure. But as Karnow describes in the chapter Nixon's War, it was really a cynical way for the U.S. to withdraw ground troops while actually increasing the violence in other ways.
Right. One critic at the time called it changing the color of the corpses.
That is incredibly dark but accurate.
And they expanded the war during this time, didn't they? Into the neighboring countries.
Yes. They significantly ramped up the bombing and expanded the ground conflict into Laos and Cambodia.
Trying to cut those supply lines on the Ho Chi Minh Trail we mentioned earlier.
Exactly, trying to bomb their way to a, quote, peace with honor. And that expansion had devastating long-term consequences for the region, like aiding the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia.
But ultimately for the U.S., the main goal was just to get out. Which brings us to the end game.
The Paris Peace Accords.
Karnow calls it the peace that never was.
That is a very fitting title for that chapter. Karnow's analysis is that the agreement was fundamentally flawed from the start.
Because it allowed the Americans to leave, which was their primary political goal by that point.
But it didn't solve the core political issue of who would actually rule Vietnam. It explicitly left North Vietnamese troops positioned inside the South.
It was essentially just a ceasefire that everyone involved knew wouldn't last. A decent interval so the U.S. wouldn't look like it was just running away.
And it certainly didn't last. The collapse in 1975 was incredibly rapid. Karnow heavily describes the total unraveling of the South Vietnamese army once the American air support and financial backing were pulled away.
The fall of Saigon. Those images are just burned into modern history.
The helicopters on the rooftops, desperate people trying to escape.
The final image of the war wasn't a treaty signing in a grand hall.
No, it was a total takeover. It was a North Vietnamese tank crashing through the iron gates of the presidential palace in Saigon.
Karnow continually emphasizes the tragic ordeal of it all. And he doesn't just mean for the Americans.
No, absolutely not. He focuses heavily on the immense human cost on all sides.
The millions of Vietnamese casualties.
The total devastation of the land itself, the lasting defoliation from Agent Orange, the mass displacement of entire communities.
And for the Americans, the soldiers who came home to a country that, frankly, didn't want to talk about what they had been through.
It was a war that left literally no one feeling like a winner.
So as we try to wrap our heads around this massive, intricate narrative, let's unpack the synthesis. What does Karnow ultimately conclude? What is the real takeaway from all this suffering?
Well, as Karnow concludes, the war was essentially a collision. On one side, you had a fierce force of national liberation. Ruthless, yes, but deeply rooted in that long history of resistance we talked about.
And on the other side, you had Cold War geopolitics, the very abstract theory of communist containment.
Exactly. One side was fighting for their home, for their very identity.
While the other was fighting for a political theory, a spot on a map.
And when those two fundamentally different aims collided, it just left massive devastation in its wake. Karnow basically argues it was a tragedy that requires careful clarification, not simple slogans.
It wasn't just a simple mistake or a pure noble cause.
It was a deeply complex historical collision.
Here is where it gets really interesting, Fang, and this is the final thought I want to leave you, our listener, with today. We started this whole discussion with that chapter on the heritage of Vietnamese nationalism.
Right, the 1,000 years of history.
Right, so if the policymakers in the 1950s and 60s had actually read and understood that chapter.
If they had understood they were stepping into a millennium-old pattern of resistance.
Exactly. Would the war have happened at all?
That is the ultimate provocative question the book raises. Is the real lesson here that ignorance of history is actually the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield?
It certainly seems that way. When you ignore the deep story people tell about themselves, you do so at your own immense peril.
This book is a heavy read, but an absolutely essential one. It forces you to look at the world with a much wider historical lens.
And we hope this deep dive helped you widen yours. If you want to really get into the weeds and see the evidence for yourself, click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and most importantly, think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.